Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Susan Chekel-Lusignan, Director of Marketing and Program Development for the Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library. FFRPL raises funds, presents programs, supports special projects, helps to create specialized spaces, and purchases supplemental materials and equipment for the Rochester Public Library. And we welcome you to Books Sandwiched In. Please silence your cell phones at this time. We are using the new recording equipment that FFRPL purchased for this auditorium so that our live stream videos are now broadcast directly to the library's YouTube channel. Masks are recommended but not required in the library at this time, and we do have masks on the back table for anyone who would like one. If you are having difficulty hearing at any time during the program, please just raise your hand and we can adjust the volume. To access the induction loop in the auditorium, please set your hearing aid to the T switch. Our thanks go to those who help fund programs like these through FFRPL, the dedicated FFRPL committee members who curate and organize these events, our guest speakers and artists who so graciously share their time and talents with us, the library staff who help with our setup and production, and the thousands of people who attend each year. In addition to presenting in-person programs like today's BSI review, FFRPL is also proud to continue to work with the library on presenting and promoting many online programs. This year, we began partnering with the Rochester Public Library and the Library Speakers Consortium to present RPL online author talks from best-selling authors and thought leaders. On November 10th, RPL will present an online author talk with New York Times bestselling author Bonnie Garmus, whose book title is Lessons in Chemistry. On November 15th, RPL will present an online author talk with bestselling author Kwame Christian, whose featured book title is How to Have Difficult Conversations About Race. And on December 6th, RPL will present an online author talk with Geraldine Brooks, Pulitzer Prize-winning author of March, People of the Book, and The Secret Chord, and her most recent title is Horse. Registration information is posted on our website, ffrpl.org, as well as the library's website, rockcitylibrary.org. All talks are free, and you can participate and ask the author questions in real time during the online event, or you can access the archived talks at your own convenience once they are posted. Today's Book Sandwiched In review is of Undelivered, the Never-Heard Speeches That Would Have Rewritten History by Jeff Nussbaum. Our reviewer today is Curt Smith. Smith is a senior lecturer of English at the University of Rochester, where he teaches courses in presidential rhetoric and public speaking. He's a former presidential speechwriter for George H.W. Bush, and he's the author of 18 books, including the celebrated Voices of the Game. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Smith to our podium.
Well, first of all, good afternoon, and I want to thank all of you for coming out on this lovely day to this wonderful library. I second everything that Susan just said, not simply about this series, but moreover about the Rochester Public Library. Susan mentioned that I've written several books, and my first books in the 1970s and 80s were largely written here in the library itself, in the old library, in terms of the microfilm, which was able to be my linchpin, if you would, toward discovering fact, anecdote, story, so essential to any book. So let me second again what Susan has just said. And I'd like to thank her for her introduction. I appreciate it very much. I have had introductions that have been somewhat less appreciative and somewhat more, but whatever it is, good, bad, or indifferent, I'm reminded of what Lyndon Johnson once said, often said, in fact, when he heard an introduction that even he thought generous. And he would say, I wish my parents had been alive to hear those words. My father would have enjoyed them, and my mother would have believed them. I'm honored to be here with you to talk about the wonder of books, a denominator that I know we all share. For about 25 minutes, I'll be talking, then invite your questions and hopefully my adequate response. We're here, as Susan said, to discuss Undelivered, the never-before speeches that would have rewritten history. Its author is Jeff Nussbaum, former speechwriter to, among others, Al Gore and Hillary Clinton. His is a stirring book. I recommend it to you unequivocally, written by someone whose ideology is a tad different than my own. Yet both of us believe in freedom of expression. That's what libraries are all about, what America is all about. I speak, incidentally, as the son of a mother who was once head librarian at Sperry High School in Rush Henrietta. So for me, this, in a sense, is coming home. This book is divided into 6 kinds of undelivered speech. As I mention each, remember what the great columnist and one presidential speechwriter, William Safire, said, quote, "What makes a speech real," he wrote, "is the speaking of it. Words on a page are no more a speech than a screenplay is a movie," unquote. After all, the audience isn't reading your speech, it's hearing you interpret it. Nussbaum's first kind of speech is words that are too hot. Rhetoric, he says, tempered based on the expectations of event organizers. He begins with what Martin Luther King originally intended to say before he changed his mind, according to Nussbaum, in mid-speech of the August 1963 historic March for Jobs and Freedom at the Lincoln Memorial. The night before he spoke, King meant to say only that America must never repeat its segregationist past. Instead, he went further. Inspired next day by the 250,000 people at the Lincoln Memorial, he forged a civil rights classic that became the dividing line between what had come before and all that has happened since. Ironically, President John F. Kennedy had been lukewarm toward the event, afraid activism could hurt him politically. Finally backing it, JFK called for, quote-unquote, a peaceful assembly for the redress of grievances. As the march's last speaker, King hoped to denounce bigotry, aid Congress's stalled civil rights bill, yet not stir violence, using his booming voice, his phrase, the fierce urgency of now, and rousing rhythm of the Negro spiritual. Midway through, he knew that the speech was not sufficient. The theme of the speech was not sufficient. Worthwhile, but not enough. It had been normalcy, never again. Reverend King had often ended addresses with his "I have a dream" litany that we're all familiar with. And that's where he headed now, knowing that while most of his aides could recite it by memory, most Americans had never even heard it once. Nussbaum writes, "Did Dr. King hear Mahalia Jackson, the great gospel singer, standing behind him, beseeching him to tell them about the dream, Martin, which she had heard many times? Who knows? Only that the dream became the perfect soundtrack for what King dubbed a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. Let freedom ring," he repeated, naming different parts of America, ending, of course, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Watching on television in the Oval Office, Kennedy now said, "He's good." About 5 seconds later, "Damn good." Then he invited King and other activists to the White House. When it came to equality in America, nothing has been the same since. Nussbaum calls the second class of speech a change of mind, a change of heart, in which a speaker with 2 choices to proceed at the last minute chooses one over the other. It's often said that a week in politics is like a year or decade anywhere else. I agree, for good and bad. Richard Nixon would agree, for good and bad. This book cites a speech Nixon considered giving, in which he declined to resign the presidency in 1974. Ultimately, he gave another speech, becoming the first U.S. president to resign. In 1972, Nixon had been reelected to a second term, winning a mammoth 49 to 50 states, including nearly 61% of the popular vote. Despite how, that June of 1972, 5 workers of his reelection team, or the Republican Party, had broken into the Democratic National Committee. at D.C.'s Watergate Hotel. 2 years later, in '74, that break-in and subsequent cover-up led the House of Representatives to approve 3 articles of impeachment. Nixon then almost gave a national television speech to oppose Senate conviction. The draft that he did not give read, he had reason, I should say, in just a moment I'll get to that, but he would oppose Senate conviction. He had reason, writes Nussbaum, to believe a speech could work and to believe in Nixon's own powers of persuasion. In 1952, nominated for vice president, Nixon had faced charges of political slush fund. He took to network TV to profess innocence in the famed Checkers speech, so named for the dog a supporter had given Nixon's children that the candidate vowed not to return. This speech that Nussbaum calls personal, professional, and powerful had saved Nixon's career. Now, 22 years later, in 1974, could another speech save it now? On August 5th, 1974, Nixon released a tape of him showing possible obstruction of justice. Nussbaum presents a speech draft whereby, facing Senate trial, he refused to quit, saying that resignation would establish the principle that under pressure, a president could be removed by means short of those provided by the Constitution. Therefore, his undelivered draft went, "I shall see the constitutional process through. I shall appear before the Senate and answer all questions under oath." Nixon, as we know, never gave that speech. His Gallup poll approval, once 68%, was now in the 20s. So that August 8, he gave another speech, noting, "I have never been a quitter, but as president, I must put the interests of America first." Next day, Nixon resigned, bidding his staff farewell and saying, "Defeat is only a beginning. The young must know it, the old must know it. Only if you have been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is on the highest mountain." Millions sobbed watching on TV. Likely, more were glad to see him go. That impromptu speech is how many recall him, even now. This book's third kind of speech is titled Crisis and Crisis Averted. It described the short-lived reign of the King of England, Edward VIII, who in 1936 wished to marry a Baltimore socialite, Wallis Simpson, hoping that she would become queen. To Nussbaum, Edward was, quote unquote, a drinking, womanizing, indiscreet playboy. That's Nussbaum. When he became king that January, England's state church, the Church of England, however, forbade marriage to divorcees with living former spouses. And until May 1937, Mrs. Simpson was still wed to her second. As you can imagine, the scandal rocked Parliament and Edward's parents, then King George V and Queen Mary. The press had kept the affair secret, private, for most of 1936. When disclosed, the king, long smitten by Wallis, vainly hoped his public would warm to her. Personally, good luck. Meantime, aides drafted a speech in which Edward would have said he needed a happy married life to share the burdens of his office. In the speech he never gave, Edward asked Britain to reflect on what he wanted, to marry Wallis, retain the crown, but not now insist that Mrs. Simpson become queen. By then, most of his subjects simply wanted Edward going, gone. He resigned in a December 1936 delivered speech. "You must believe me," said Edward, "when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would like to do them without the help and support of the woman I love." The address praised his brother and successor, George VI, ending with, "God save the king." We leave this speech on a revealing what might have been note. A year after abdicating, Edward, now titled the Duke of Windsor, visited his good friend Adolf Hitler in Berlin and went hunting with Nazi Field Marshal Hermann Goering. This is the man who would have been England's king during World War II. By 1940-41, during the Blitz of London, only Britain stood between Hitler and us. One day, Nazi spies in England sent this telegram to Berlin, quote, "The Duke of Windsor, the former king, believes with certainty that continued heavy bombing will make England ready for peace," unquote. Think of that. The former King of England is advising Germany on how to bomb and incinerate England. What a guy. The king says Nussbaum was committing treason. I agree. The man who became the new king, George VI, and wife Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, beloved Queen Mother, I might add, toured London's shattered East End after the Nazis also bombed Buckingham Palace. I'm glad we have been bombed, she said. It makes me feel like I can look the East End in the face. What a line. Such royalty ennobled history. Undelivered's Part 4, The Fog of War, The Path to Peace, presents speeches which, had they been delivered, would have changed history. None were given because none of the events occurred. One speech concerns then General, the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, and later 1953 through 61, President Dwight Eisenhower. A campaign button of the age read simply, "I like Ike," which said it all. Millions of Americans did, largely because they trusted the man who was Allied Supreme Commander in World War II, had overseen Operation Overlord, 1944's D-Day invasion, to rescue Europe from Hitler. I believe the seminal day of the 20th century. Ike's most noted biographer, Stephen Ambrose, said the secret to his success, meaning Eisenhower, was honesty. Having interviewed hundreds of his associates, Ambrose wrote, "I never once found Ike in a personal lie." In 1944, Ike faced a personal decision, whether to approve the largest ever amphibious assault by U.S. and Allied troops crossing the Channel from Britain to Normandy. High winds and rough seas, as many of you know, postponed it a day till June the 6th. Another day would mean a wait of at least 2 weeks for a favorable moon and tides. By then, it is more than likely that Hitler would have learned of the pending invasion and would have been prepared for it. Instead, at 4:30 a.m. on the 5th, Ike told a staff meeting, "Okay, we'll go." That was it. Later adding, "I hope to God I'm right." He met with paratroopers, you may remember the photos, some of whom soon lost their lives, next day issuing a statement that the hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. More tellingly, more personal, Eisenhower wrote on a card what he would say if the invasion failed. It read, "Our landings have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." Had the invasion failed, writes Nussbaum, some historians feel that Germany might never have surrendered unconditionally. Instead, in 1964, CBS's Walter Cronkite and Ike returned to Normandy, where, of course, the landings occurred. This is what Ike said. "I felt a personal responsibility," he noted, "of the invasion, so I wrote a little thing on this card," and he showed the card, "that soundly assumed that we were going to be defeated, telling no one about the card or what he had intended to do if, in fact, the invasion had failed, telling no one till an aide of his, seeing the card, included it in his diary. I was the one," Ike told Cronkite, "that was responsible for the decision to go, and if it failed, all the fault belongs to me, and that's that. I was going to oblivion anyway, so I might as well take responsibility." Instead, he found fame, America's trust in him redeemed. Biographer Michael Korda wrote, "Our troops trusted him. They were willing to die for him." In 1969, the year of his death, and 8 years after leaving the presidency, Ike at 78 was still named the most admired person by Americans in a Gallup poll. Astounding. Undelivered also tells how Ike's successor as president, John F. Kennedy, learned on October 16, 1962, from aerial photos that launching pads were being built for intermediate long-range nuclear Soviet missiles on their client state of Cuba, 90 miles from Florida. Any of us who are alive at that point will remember this crisis. JFK's advisors favored a naval blockade of any military shipments headed there. By contrast, the Joint Chiefs of Staff urged a surprised airstrike against the island, saying a blockade of Cuba followed by diplomacy, was inadequate and just as likely to lead to war. U.S. troops went on high alert to counter the missiles as Kennedy and Kremlin officials met. Kennedy had to consider, should America strike by air or try another alternative? U.S. officials debated for 13 days. First, aides prepared a speech the military favored that wanted an airstrike on Soviet-Premier Nikita Khrushchev's nuclear stockpiles. With a heavy heart, that undelivered speech, the speech never given, began, I have ordered, and the United States Air Force has now carried out military preparations, operations with conventional weapons only to remove a major nuclear weapons buildup from the soil of Cuba. Later, Nussbaum says, we learned that the Soviets might have responded to such a U.S. aerial bombardment and ground invasion, quote unquote, by vaporizing our base at Guantanamo Bay and our invasion force. A nuclear bomb would clearly have killed almost or indeed everyone. As the standoff continued, Kennedy's undelivered draft accused the Soviets of, quote unquote, barefaced falsehoods and said such dishonesty made it necessary to quickly remove the missiles so the Soviets could not restore them. As noted, JFK did not deliver this speech. Rather, he called the Soviet deployment, quote unquote, a clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace. He quarantined shipments of military equipment to Cuba and told Khrushchev that a nuclear attack from there would mean full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. Secretly, Kennedy vowed to ultimately dismantle American missile bases in Turkey. In Cuba, the communists removed theirs. Part 5 of Undelivered is titled The People Choose. Speeches not given due to defeat. A contemporary example is Hillary Clinton on 2016's election night. Mrs. Clinton had expected that evening to become the first woman chosen president, so her speech had been written, debated, and edited in advance. Almost all major speeches go through the mill in terms of research for accuracy, as indeed they should. She planned to say, had she been elected, my fellow Americans, through a long, hard campaign, we were challenged to choose between two visions for America. Through what President Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, she said, we met that challenge. Instead, after phoning her opponent, Donald Trump, to congratulate him, Mrs. Clinton said, would have said, this is not the outcome we wanted. She did, in fact, say this. This is not the outcome we wanted, or that we worked so hard for, the nation more deeply divided than we thought. But I want you to remember this. Our campaign was never about one person or even about one election. It was about the country we love. So let us not lose heart, for there are more seasons to come. This is the speech that Mrs. Clinton did not give. That year, someone had asked that if she could go back in time and tell anyone about her becoming the first president to be elected. The person asked her, who would she choose? Mrs. Clinton answered, Mother Dorothy, who had had a very hard youth. Mrs. Clinton said, or would have said, she was abandoned by her parents at age 8. They put her on a train to California, where she was mistreated by her grandparents and ended up on her own working as a housemaid. Again, this is the speech she did not give, but had been prepared to give. Mrs. Clinton then continued, Dorothy had taught her daughter, do all the good you can, for all the people you can, in all the ways that you can, as long as you can. Staff said that Mrs. Clinton often talked about her mother that election year, riding that train alone. In her speech, she hoped to say, but did not get the chance to say, I wish I could walk down the aisle and find the little wooden seats where she sat, holding tight to her even younger sister. She doesn't yet know how much she will suffer, unquote, or whether Dorothy would find strength to survive. Looking out, Hillary said, staring at the vast country. Mrs. Clinton dreamt of taking her mother in her arms to say, you will have a good family of your own and 3 children. You will survive. And as hard as it might be to imagine, your daughter will grow up and become the President of the United States. That dream eluded her then. Ahead, who knows? Such certainty is also germane to the last part 6 of this book, when events intervene. Let me leave you with 2 speeches. death or danger preventing them from having been given. Franklin Roosevelt frequently spoke by radio from the White House to tens of millions of listeners, often in the fireside chat, his simple talk among friends. FDR led America through its two great 20th century crises, neither victory ever finally sure, the Global Depression and World War II, rallying a nation when often all looked lost, as it must have to Roosevelt when polio struck him in 1921. When FDR died in his fourth term on April 12, 1945, at age 63 of a cerebral hemorrhage, almost every American felt a private memory. Perhaps Roosevelt's first inaugural, or hearing him after Pearl Harbor, perhaps his D-Day prayer, or caressing my little dog, Vala. All the notes of emotion played by friendship or something more. FDR's undelivered final speech was to have been given by radio to a Democratic Party dinner in Washington. The war would be over by September 2 of 45, and FDR was looking ahead. We Americans seek peace, he said, enduring peace, or intended to say. If civilization is to survive, we must cultivate the science of human relationships, the ability of all peoples, of all kinds, to live together and work together in the same world at peace. That is what he had intended to say in his final speech on Earth. The subject of my final story knew turmoil as well as peace. Helen Keller, deaf, blind, and uncommonly brave. Born in 1880, Keller met Alexander Graham Bell 6 years later, the famous inventor working then with deaf children. Bell urged Helen's parents to contact the Perkins School for the Blind in Boston, where Anne Sullivan, herself suffering from an eye disease, was partially blind. Later, Helen enrolled at Perkins, Sullivan her teacher, governess, and friend, who taught Keller vocabulary based on Helen's interest by spelling each word out into her palm. At 14, Keller met Mark Twain and followed his gestures with her fingertips, the humorist calling Helen one of the two most interesting characters of the 19th century. Napoleon, for some reason, was the other. Keller ultimately tired of talking only about her childhood. She wanted to talk politics. At 31, publishing an essay, I Am a Socialist, and why disability, she said, should be named a civil right. In 1913, slated to speak at a woman's suffrage rally, Helen met a mob of male drunks who violently broke up the meeting. As a result, she didn't speak, barely even able to reach the grandstand safely. The text of what she had wished to say began, I am proud to share in your brave work for the emancipation of women. For my victorious fight against the dark, I bring you good cheer in your worldwide battle for life. I am deaf, but I hear the glad tidings of women's liberation. I am blind, she said, but I see the dawning light of a new day when there shall be no woman enslaved, nor child robbed of the sweet joy of childhood in the war of daily bread. All earthly opposition, she ended, cannot stay our onward march. In this, she was a prophet. Keller said that her greatest disappointment was being unable to speak formally. As Jeff Nussbaum says, listening to audio of Helen, you can hear that she spoke in the distinctive diction and modulation found in those who have learned to talk without being able to hear, unquote. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, quote, speech is power. Speech is to persuade, to convert, unquote. Yet there is another kind of speech, the unspoken ability to sense love, show love. That was Helen Keller's kind, her story among the best of this rousing and uplifting book. Thank you.